Good morning again. Thanks for joining us. My name is Amanda Callahan. I coordinate Counselor Connect, which is a initiative of the Central Indiana Educational Service Center, or CIESC. I am thrilled we are collaborating on today's coffee talk session with the Indiana School Counselor Association. So thank you to ISCA. Our guest presenter today is Scott Carr, and Scott is the Vice President with Catalyst Public Affairs Group. And he also works closely with ISCA as their lobbyist and their legislative contact person. So thank you, ISCA, for letting us borrow Scott today and being able to hear a little bit about what happened during this most recent legislative session. As always, we are recording the session. So if you need to jump off early and need to go back and listen to something later on, then you can certainly do that as well. Also, just a reminder, if you want to go ahead and mute yourself, if you want to check and make sure you're muted, so then we don't get any background noise, that would be
Tell her
great.
that I will come get her later then. Okay.
All right. Sorry, Scott, I'm trying to mute everybody here. I'm going to mute everybody, but you may have to unmute yourself again before you start talking. Okay, you're good. All right. Scott, I'm going to hand it right off to you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, so much. And thank you, everyone who is taking a moment to join. My name is Scott Carr with Catalyst Public Affairs Group. And we have had the distinct honor and privilege to represent the Indiana School Counselor Association for over a decade. It's something that we're very proud of, and the work that we do is something we take very seriously on behalf of the Indiana School Counselor Association. The association, as many of you may or may not be aware, is a diverse association. It has representatives, counselors from a variety of different school models, but all are welcome and all are members of the association. What I'd like to do today is just spend a few minutes sort of giving you a lay of the land as we went into the legislative session. A little conversation about how the legislative session progressed. From there, I'll stop for any general questions just about the legislative session, and then we'll dive into a few bills. The bills in which I'd like to speak about today, the first is House Enrolled Act 1001. That is the state budget for the new biennium, which will begin on July 1. The next bill would be House Bill 1002, which is a House Majority Priority Bill, which sought to deregulate and to eliminate parts of education code that had been sort of incorporated over the last 10 to 15 years. Specifically, I'd like to talk about Senate Bill 453, which is important to school counselors as well. And that was authored by Senator Donato this session, and also authored by her last session as well, too. We'll talk about Senate Bill 1, which was the governor and House and Senate priorities property tax reform bill, which was signed into law last week. And then finally, we'll talk about just some concepts that the Indiana school counselors have put forward legislatively for consideration at the State House. So before I begin and dive into sort of just a 30,000 foot recap of the last 4 or 5 months. Are there any questions, or is there anything that anyone on here would like me to speak about specifically that I can add to my list? Okay, hearing none, I'll go ahead and start with my spiel then. So, obviously, the cast of characters of the 150th or the 124th General Assembly were elected last November. Every year, there are 100 members, or every 2 years, 100 members of the Indiana House are up for election, and 25 members of the Indiana Senate is up for election. It rotates every 2 years. So half of the Senate is up every 2 years. The entire House is up every 2 years. So once that election took place, we really knew what the General Assembly would look like. We had a new governor who was elected, a very transitional governor. There's been a sort of a continuity in the executive branch, I would say, for 12 to 14 years, really, as it relates to policy and personnel and just a philosophy. And under the new governor, it was really a call to change. from his administration and the way in which he chose to engage with the legislature early, often, and on major pieces of legislation. He came in with large priorities, everything from healthcare to education, and was largely very successful in his legislative agenda. I think it's something just for anyone who works in this space to be cognizant about, is that relationship between the legislature and the governor is very different moving forward. And it's something to be mindful of as you engage both bodies, depending on what your policy arguments are. It's important to sort of note that the looming shadow over the entire legislative session was the budget forecast. What was the budget going to look like? Was it going to be positive? Was it going to be negative? Indiana has, for the better part of 10 years or so, operated with a budget, probably about 12 years, operated with a significant budget surplus. In fact, the budget surplus has been so high at times that taxpayers have received by state law a refund because our surplus has exceeded what we allow in state law, and that automatically triggers a refund to taxpayers. So we knew going into this session that things were going to be different. Legislative leaders had cautioned everyone, to be prepared for worst case scenario and hope for the best. December's forecast was a mix of both. It essentially said, hey, we think we'll have some growth. It'll be small, but call it $600 million, $700 million in new growth. The outside fiscal challenge that we're having in the state, it's not unique to Indiana, but it does, because of the way our HIP 2.0 is the Healthy Indiana Plan works for Medicaid, it is a significant fiscal issue for us in the state of Indiana. So we were off 2 years ago, we being the state of Indiana, off by about $1 billion in what was anticipated to be the Medicaid spend and what the Medicaid spend actually became. This was not, this was a mistake on the part of a vendor that did the budgeting forecast and the budgeting work for the state of Indiana. But regardless of that error, that $1 billion hole needed to be filled. So over the last, 14 months or so, there's been some things that were able to be done behind the scenes to help plug that gap and to get it down to about 450 to 600 million. So if you're looking at about $700 million worth of growth and you got a $600 million hole, that's basically gone on day one. And then you anticipate an even larger Medicaid expense coming down the horizon over the next 2 years, and you begin operating somewhat in a deficit to even start with. As we progressed through the legislative session, there was some optimism that those numbers would get better, but as we get to April, it turned out not to be the case. The legislative session began in early January. This was a budget writing year at the Indiana State House. It was 4 months long. It begins in January, and they must sine die by law on April 29th. They did adjourn this year, sine die on April 25th, a few days early, which I'm very grateful for, to get that time back on my calendar. Sad to say goodbye to 150 of my best friends, but also happy to start turning towards the work of implementing whatever laws the General Assembly put forth. It was a very busy session. There were thousands of bills that were filed. There are super majorities in both the House and the Senate. The composition in the Indiana House is 70 members of the Republican Party, 30 members of the Democrat Party. In the Indiana Senate, it is 40 members of the Republican Party and 10 members of the Democrat minority. Therefore, when you are in a composition of a legislature with supermajorities, the minority doesn't even need to be present in order for business to be conducted. That's sort of the definition of a superminority. So with that, taking that into consideration, right, you really have one party sort of moving the levers and deciding which way in which to conduct business. I will say, though, and I think it's a very important note for us to add, that Indiana is not like Washington, D.C. I would say annually, it's about 90% of all votes at the Indiana State House are bipartisan or unanimous. If you add in the curve matrix and take away just one or two no votes on either side of a bill, that number even gets up to about 94-95% of all bills are almost unanimously bipartisan, right? So, you know, our legislature works very well together, both sides of the aisle, and we're lucky to have that in Indiana. The session is divided into three parts. The first half of the legislative session, or the first third, if you will, it's kind of hard to put it into context because you have 2 months, 6 weeks, and then 2 weeks. But we call it the first half. That's when bills are heard. You're working committee chairs, you're working legislators to either hear a bill or not hear a bill. And you move through that process through the first half of the legislative session. The second half of the session is bills that were heard in the first half, but heard in the opposite chamber of origination. So if it was a Senate bill that passed out of the Indiana Senate, it now must go to the Indiana House where the bill is heard there. It can either be heard or not heard, amended or not amended, and all of those sort of change the course and direction of how a bill becomes a law. If a bill is heard in its opposite chamber of origination, and the bill is amended, it then goes back to its original chamber of origination where the bill's author can either dissent or concur on the changes that are made. If the bill author concurs on the changes, there's one more vote on that bill before it heads off to the governor to become law. If the bill is dissented upon by the bill's author, which means, hey, listen, I'm not so sure I like the changes you made to my bill, then a conference committee is created for that bill. It is one member of each party in each chamber. So 4 members, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats would then serve on that conference committee to hopefully strike a balance and come to an agreement on that bill. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes conferees are removed and other conferees are put on in order to get a conference committee report signed and adopted, but that is the intention of how that process is supposed to work. We continue to move through the second half of the legislative session. A lot of bills were not heard. This is really a period of fine tweaking. It's where a lot of folks get engaged on the details and the nuances of legislation, where you can take a little bit more time and say, hey, we got to think through this part of the bill or this part of the bill, and either find a solution or decide you got to come back next year to figure that out. And then the third part of the legislative session is called conference committee time, and that is what I was just discussing. It lasts about 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks. And these are where conference committees meet to hash out the details between the House and Senate versions of a piece of legislation before ultimately voting on it. That sort of wraps up the process that we just went through. This year, because it was a budget writing year, it is a 4-month-long session. Next year, we call it a short session. It'll begin in early January and it will end. It must end by law by March 14th next year. So it is about 6 to 7 weeks shorter than a long legislative session. I'll pause there before we start to dive into some specific pieces of legislation. Can I answer any questions about the legislative process or sort of what just happened before we discuss specific bills? Amanda, I'm not seeing any. I just want to make sure there aren't any before I move on.
Yep, no questions in the chat so far.
Great. Well, we're going to start off with Senate Enrolled Act 1. As a note, when bills are filed, they are called a Senate bill or a House bill. And when they become law, they become a Senate Enrolled Act or a House Enrolled Act. So you'll hear me referring to enrolled acts because these are bills that have become law. Or you'll hear me referring to a bill that was a Senate bill or a House bill. And that is a bill that failed to become law, but was presented and voted on this session. We'll begin with Senate Enrolled Act 1. Senate Enrolled Act 1 was a Senate majority piece of property tax legislation. It was authored by Chairman Travis Holdman from the Northeast Indiana region. He is the chairman of the Tax and Fiscal Policy Committee in the Indiana Senate. His legislation, as originally drafted, was essentially the incoming governor's property tax plan that he had campaigned on. It was the highest priority for the governor, and Chairman Holdman filed that legislation and began the process of moving that forward. It's important that I start here because where the bill ends and how it affects local school districts is just important for everyone to be cognizant of. The bill was heard in the Senate and it was amended. It was sort of dramatically amended. I would say many of the governor's high priority policy positions were watered down, reduced, or eliminated as the bill left the Indiana Senate. And I won't bore you with the details because the bill changed so many times that I just want to talk about the final version so I don't confuse anyone. The bill then went to the Indiana House. In the Indiana House, it was heard in the Ways and Means Committee under Chairman Thompson, who is the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and Vice Chairman Snow, who is vice chair of the Ways and Means Committee. Chairman Snow, or Vice Chair Snow, being the bill's sponsor in the Indiana House. They heard somewhere in the tune of 10 hours worth of testimony as it related to Senate Bill 1. In the following testimony, there was a separate bill that they also heard about 8 or 9 hours of testimony on, which was Senate Bill 518. This was a revenue sharing property tax bill with charter schools and non-charter schools, public schools, not private schools. They heard testimony on both of these bills over 2 weeks, in total somewhere between 18 and 20 hours of total testimony. The following week, the Ways and Means Committee reconvened. They amended Senate Bill 518 into Senate Enrolled Act 1. They also included a lot of business personal property tax eliminations. This is a taxing source that is used for schools, businesses, counties, cities, towns, to fund police officers, firefighters, education, you name it. It was a major shift in public policy. It had very large and significant impacts to local jurisdictions and their budgets and how their budgets would look moving forward. At the end of the day, a second reading amendment was offered. A second reading amendment is when a bill has moved to the entire chamber and any member of that chamber can offer an amendment on the bill. The bill stripped away a lot of the language that had been included on business personal property tax, watered it down, changed it a little bit, and finalized what the caps were. That amendment and that bill at that time would be concurred upon by the Senate's author and moved on to the governor for signature. What that bill did, Senate Enrolled Act 1, at the very end of the day, was either give a $300 tax credit or 10% assessed value credit, whichever is greater, or no, whichever is less, or no more than, to every homeowner in the state who is paying property taxes. So, it's effective 2026. If your property tax bills were set to go up by $700 in 2026, they would now only go up $400. This is a 3-year bill with the tune of about $1.2 billion in reduced property tax revenue at the local level. Included in that was an option to increase what is called LIT, which is a local income tax. It provides the ability for cities or counties to up how much LIT they can currently collect in order to offset property tax losses across the state. That is not a tool available to educators. It's not a tool available to school systems or districts. The only mechanism that remains in order to offset that loss at the local level is a school referendum. There were more, I would call it guardrails, put around how schools can conduct school referendums, also included. So there is not a school district in the state that will not have to tighten their belts to some extent moving forward, beginning in 2026 when these property tax reductions begin to take place. I think it's just something for everybody to be mindful of. It'll be affecting budgets at every single level, and we'll have to figure out what happens from there. So as the second half adjourned and Senate Enrolled Act 1 moved out, we then had our final April budget forecast. The April budget forecast, the final one that happens in April, is ultimately what determines how much money we will or will not have in the state budget moving forward for the next 2 years, beginning on July 1, which is the state's fiscal year. That budget forecast came back ruby red, very bad. In fact, probably the worst the state has had since 2008. The difference being in 2008, during the Great Recession, when we had a large budget deficit anticipated, we could at that time expect some federal relief. There's no federal relief coming from this budget. Given the uncertainty with different taxes, given the uncertainty with tariffs, and just some things coming out of Washington in general, our large Medicaid overspend, which is anticipated, we actually came in $400 million under budget for the current year, or over budget for the current year, and a $2 billion deficit over the biennium for the next 2 years, starting in July 1. This left lawmakers with extremely difficult choices to make. Budgets were slashed, line items were gone. There was everything was on the table. A combination of all of the above was done to balance the budget, which is required under Indiana's Constitution. There was an increase for the first time in almost 20 years in the cigarette tax by $2 per pack, which will raise roughly $800 million and help cover a significant portion of that budget Medicaid deficit. All those dollars will be dedicated towards health and Medicaid issues. There'll be some money that comes out of our reserves, our surplus that we have in the bank, our rainy day fund, to help cover the gap. And then the rest came from budget cuts. Every government agency, state agency saw 5% reduction or more. Many line items, including the Indiana School Principals Conference, which would get $1 million line item every year in the budget, gone. I mean, it was a very, very tough 10 days for many folks in a lot of different ways at the State House. But at the end of the day, they came to an agreement on the budget forecast, and they moved House Enrolled Act 1001 out, and it was signed by the governor just yesterday into law. I mean, that's where we are in the process. Of note, though, something that was interesting and established in the state budget is the Freedom and Opportunity Grant Fund. It was originally funded at $87 million each year of the biennium. So a little over about 175 million-ish over the 2 years. That was reduced to 50 million per year. There is an enormous list of eligible entities who can tap into this funding. It's unclear at the moment, at least from my understanding, how all of that money will be spent. That 100 million will be spent. But school counselors are included in that as an eligible expense. So it'll be interesting to see how that correlates beginning on July 1 over the next 2 years. Not to get anybody's hope up, but if the budget forecast does improve between now and December, and it looks like budget projections were just off, and the economy did not go into a recession, and tariffs did not have as much of an impact as anticipated, there's room for trailer language, that's it's companion language, to emerge next session. That could be gap filling legislation, even in a non-budget year. It doesn't happen often, But I think under the extenuating circumstances of this last legislative session, it's a possibility. But I would not say it's certain. I wouldn't even say it's 50-50. I'd say a lot of things got to go right for us to get there. I would encourage anyone, and I'm happy to drop it in the link, to just take a look through the state budget. If you've never done so before, see the things that are in there, see where money goes, and just sort of take the opportunity to spend 45 minutes and comb through it. It's a 200-page document, but it'll give you an idea of where things go. Another item listed in the budget that was a high priority of the governor was a universal voucher program. So currently, 2 years ago, the Indiana voucher scholarship was capped at 400% of the federal poverty level. That cap has now been completely eliminated. It will not begin in fiscal year 25, but it will begin in fiscal year 26. It's just something important to know whenever I'm speaking to anyone in the education field. I know that's a line item to reference. The last thing to include is Senate Bill 518. This was amended into Senate Enrolled Act 1. As I mentioned earlier, Senate Enrolled Act 1 had a fiscal impact of about $1.2 billion to local units, which includes schools. Senate Bill 518 creates a pathway for property tax dollars to follow a student to a charter school. Currently, if a student enrolls in a charter school, you may or may not be aware, but the state allocated dollars no longer go to the school district, they go to the charter school. However, the property tax dollars stay with the local district and do not go and do not follow the student. The language included in Senate Enrolled Act 1, which came from Senate Bill 518 out of the Senate, creates a pathway where those dollars begin to be shared starting in 2 years. And then by 2030, I believe, 100% of those local property tax dollars are then shared as well. And depending on your community, depending on your school district, depending on the prevalency of the charter schools and where you are or where not at, it could be an enormous impact, or it could be a non-impact to the fiscal numbers. But again, I raise that up just to be thinking about the stability and fiscal body of the local school systems. Can I stop and answer any questions on fiscal things before I move on to some school counselor specific policy? Okay, seeing none, I'll move on. The Indiana School Counselor Association a few years ago sort of decided among ourselves that there were policy positions in which we wanted to begin a little more to advocate for. Really trying to assist those school counselors, those members of the Indiana School Counselor Association who are dealing with very high ratios. As many of you may or may not know, we are either the worst student to counselor ratio in the nation, or we're in the top 3. It depends on the year, right? So we're either in the top 3 or we're the worst. Top 3 worst or the worst. It varies from year to year, but that seems to be the track for the last 4 to 5 years and beyond. A few years ago, we had a summer study committee that recommended that Indiana have a 250-to-1 ratio of counselors to students. And we've yet to see any action on that item. As we sort of worked among ourselves as an organization, there were a few things that really emerged that are extraordinarily burdensome for school counselors, and that relates to testing for the most part, and the amount of time that's devoted to that, and some other non-counseling related activities that are taking away from counselors' ability to do what they're trained to do. Therefore, in the last 2 legislative sessions, we have had bills filed which would essentially create a guardrail that says if you are in a school with a ratio that exceeds 350 students to one counselor, then counselors would have to opt into non-counseling related activities. They could still do all the other things if they chose to do so, but we have some counselors who are dealing with 450, 550, 600 or more students to counselor ratio. They are in dire situations for some sort of relief to be able to do their job and to be as efficient as possible. And we thought this was a good compromise. This bill did move last session out of the Indiana Senate. It was almost a unanimous vote. It was authored by Senator Lysing. It did not receive a hearing in the Indiana House. This year, the language was included in two bills. It was heard in committee, but held without a vote. We look forward to continuing the conversation and moving it forward over the summer and into the fall with our partners in other education associations to hopefully find some area in which we can all agree to provide the relief to counselors who need it most with very, very high student to counselor ratios so that they can do the job in which they were trained to do, hired to do, and can expertly perform. So I will stop there. I've taken up, I've spoken for nearly 30 minutes. Would love to open it up for some Q&A and answer any particular questions that we have. The next steps for the legislature are they will come back in June for a technical corrections day. And depending on the budget, what comes out of Washington, D.C. Under the budget reconciliation, fingers crossed, that is not have a significant fiscal impact to the state of Indiana. So we do not need to have a special session. But if there is something that emerges from Washington, the governor would then have to call a special session and they would have to come back in and address those issues. But hopefully we can avoid that. Hopefully, knock on wood, it'll be January before the legislature returns.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions. You can either put any questions into the chat or unmute yourselves if you're able to ask anything. And I think in my follow-up email to everybody who registered, I will try and include some of the links to a few of the bills, or really the House Enrolled Acts that you mentioned. I'll include some links for people to kind of find some more information and read through those if interested. We do have something in the chat here. If you're an ISCA member and interested in joining the advocacy committee, email Kendall, and they meet monthly throughout the year and weekly during the session. Thank you.
Kendall does a wonderful job leading the advocacy committee.
But I'm sure she's always looking for more people to join. So if this is an area of interest to you, or if you're passionate about the advocacy piece, definitely join her. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share some of the next few slides to kind of close the session. However, if you think of a question, please add it into the chat. We'll be on here for the next few minutes if you do have other questions. Here is a very short evaluation form, which I can link in the chat here in just a second. If you want to complete this for your attendance today, then you will receive a PGP certificate directly into your email inbox. We have some upcoming events yet this school year. I think we just have maybe 2 remaining in this month of May. So take a look at those. Other upcoming events we have, Keep Indiana Learning is offering a summer conference in Noblesville, and there will be a counselor strand. If you want to visit the KindleCon website, you can find more information on sessions and speakers. The other conference I want to mention is later, it's in November, but is the annual ISCA conference in Indianapolis. I believe registration for that is now open. I think the call for proposals just ended. If that's not correct, somebody correct me in the chat, but I believe proposals have ended, but registration is open for that conference. Finally, some resources and all of our contact information. Does anybody have any other questions for Scott while he's still with us?
Well, I always encourage everyone, if you've never done so, you can go on to iga.gov, find legislator, and you type in your address, and it pulls up who your state rep and state senator are. And in there's a direct link to an email to them. If you've never done so, just email your legislator. Just say, hey, my name is Scott. I just wanted to email you and say, thank you for your work this session, or thank you for your service to the state of Indiana. I am a school counselor, or I am a teacher or an educator. If you would ever like to talk, let me know. And just sort of do that as an exercise, so that in the event that something ever does come up that you feel passionate about and you want to engage your local state senator or state representative, you've already done it in one way or another, or to let them know that you're frustrated, whatever it may be, and participate in that civic process. But it is a great way to do it. If you have never done it before, it's always sort of where I leave. It's my ask of you, if you will, to just take the time to do that. It doesn't take more than 2 minutes of your time. And who knows, you may get a call or an email back from your state senator and state rep saying, hey, let's have coffee. I'd love to learn more.
Absolutely. Great advice, Scott. Thank you for that. Okay. Well, I just dropped a few links in just from those last few slides. So if you do want to fill out the evaluation form or check out upcoming events or the conferences I mentioned, those links are in the chat now if you want to grab those. Otherwise, thank you again, Scott. We appreciate your time and sharing of the information. That was very helpful, and we're glad everybody joined us, and we hope to see everybody soon. Take care and have a great end to your school year. Bye-bye.